In the spring of 2026, the man who built JetBlue from nothing stood up and said the quiet part out loud. His own airline, he warned, could be bankrupt within the year. And nobody, he added, would want to buy the whole company anyway, because the whole company came bolted to $9 billion of debt. Sit with that for a second. It takes something extraordinary for a founder to say that about the thing he created. Because this is the same airline that once walked into the most avoided airport in America, an airport every giant had run screaming from and turned it into a fortress. For 20 years, that bet looked like pure genius. But here is the part almost nobody saw coming. The single piece of JetBlue that everyone still wants, the one asset a legacy giant is circling right now, is the exact same asset that made JetBlue famous in the first place. And that giant has quietly worked out something ruthless. It does not need to buy JetBlue to take the only part of JetBlue worth having. It just needs to wait. To understand how strange this situation really is, you have to remember what JetBlue actually was. When it launched in the year 2000, it did the one thing no serious airline wanted to do. It bet everything on John F. Kennedy International. Every legacy carrier of that era treated Kennedy as a punishment, too far from Manhattan, too congested, too cursed by delays to build a real domestic operation around. So they fought each other over LaGuardia instead and left Kennedy wide open. JetBlue looked at the airport nobody wanted and saw a throne with no king. It petitioned the federal government for 75 landing slots, took over a huge abandoned terminal the big carriers had walked away from, and built a stronghold at the busiest airport on the East Coast, while its rivals were still clawing at each other over a handful of gates a few miles away. That is the story of how JetBlue rose. That is a video all its own. This one is about the fall. Because the airline that conquered New York is now doing something that would have been unthinkable back then. It is running away from it. In the summer of 2026, JetBlue announced it was closing crew and maintenance bases at both Newark and LaGuardia. It shut its flight attendant base at Newark. It closed its maintenance operations at Newark and at LaGuardia both. On the surface, that reads like a simple retreat, a wounded airline pulling back from expensive turf. And New York is brutally expensive. At LaGuardia, JetBlue pays roughly $40 for every single passenger who steps onto one of its planes before that plane has burned a single drop of fuel. $40 a head just for the privilege of being there. But here is the twist. This is not only a retreat. Look at where the planes are going. They are not being parked. They are being moved to Florida. JetBlue is pulling aircraft out of New York and pouring them into Fort Lauderdale, rushing into the exact space left empty when Spirit Airlines collapsed and disappeared. So this is not purely a story of weakness. It is a story of an airline abandoning the market that made its name in order to go chase survival somewhere cheaper. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If New York built JetBlue's entire identity, why is JetBlue the one walking away from it? The answer is written on the balance sheet, and it is not pretty. JetBlue is carrying around $9 billion in debt. It has now lost money 6 years in a row. 6. And in April of 2026, the ratings agency Fitch cut JetBlue's credit rating to CCC+. That is the kind of rating lenders read as a flashing red light. The kind that means every future dollar the airline tries to borrow gets more expensive at exactly the moment it can least afford it. Now, airlines always carry heavy debt. It is a brutally capital-hungry business. You are constantly buying planes that cost more than most office towers and burning fuel by the ocean. Carrying debt is normal, but $9 billion sitting on top of 6 straight years of losses is not normal weight. It is the kind of load that leaves an airline with no room to absorb a shock, no cushion for a fuel spike, no buffer for a recession, no margin for a single bad year. And in this industry, bad years are not rare. Bad years are the weather. Now, you have probably seen a number floating around about all this, 75%. As in, a 75% chance JetBlue goes bankrupt by 2027. It has been repeated everywhere, in headline after headline, but here is what almost none of that coverage bothers to tell you. That number did not come from a Wall Street bank. It did not come from a formal credit model. It started life as a ranking exercise from a single aviation commentator online, got picked up by one outlet that dressed it in the language of analyst coverage, and then got copied by everyone else until it quietly hardened into a fact. The more rigorous bankruptcy models actually put JetBlue's real distress risk far lower than that, somewhere in the range of a quarter to a third, not three-quarters. And I am telling you this on purpose, because the honest version of this story is damning enough without the inflated statistic. You do not need a scary number when the founder of the airline is the one standing up and saying the word bankruptcy out loud. And this is where it gets genuinely strange, because the two most powerful voices in JetBlue's story are not saying the same thing. The founder, Dave Neeleman, warned openly that the airline could go under, and he made a chilling point while he did it. He said nobody would want to buy the whole company because the debt makes the whole company toxic. Meanwhile, the current chief executive, Joanna Geraghty, pushed back and said flatly that JetBlue is not planning to file for bankruptcy this year. Read those two statements side by side and notice what is missing. She said not this year. She did not say not ever. She did not say not next year. And in a moment where your own founder is publicly using the word bankruptcy, that gap, that careful silence about what happens after this year is louder than anything either of them actually said. So if the whole company is too toxic to buy, and the founder himself admits it, what happens to the one part of JetBlue that is not toxic? This is where a very large, very patient predator walks into the story, United Airlines. And its chief executive, Scott Kirby, has been remarkably open about what he actually wants. Not a merger, not the debt, not the messy route map. He wants back into Kennedy. Years ago, United walked away from Kennedy entirely, a decision Kirby has since publicly called a mistake. And rebuilding a real position there from scratch today is close to impossible, because the airport is locked up and the slots are all spoken for. So United found a shortcut. In 2025, the two airlines announced a partnership. They called it Blue Sky. And buried underneath all the friendly language about shared miles and reciprocal perks was the real trade. JetBlue agreed to hand United access to Kennedy, slots for up to 7 daily round trips beginning as early as 2027. Sit with the irony of that for a moment. The slots JetBlue fought the federal government to win. The slots that were the entire point of JetBlue's existence. Those slots are now being slid across the table to exactly the kind of legacy giant JetBlue was founded to defeat. The fortress is quietly handing the enemy a key to its own front gate. To understand why United would go through all of this for a handful of takeoff times, you have to understand what a slot at Kennedy actually is. It is not a thing you can buy off a shelf. At a congested airport like Kennedy, the number of times a plane is allowed to take off and land is capped and controlled and defended. You cannot conjure new ones out of thin air. You cannot pay to create more. The only way to get them is to take them from someone who already has them, which means a slot holds its value even when the airline holding it is bleeding out on the floor. Think about that. A brand can collapse. Customer loyalty can evaporate overnight. A whole route map can be torn up in an afternoon. But a commanding position at one of the most constrained airports in the country does not decay. If anything, as the airport grows more crowded and more impossible to break into, those slots quietly grow more valuable. And that is the cruel logic sitting underneath this entire story. JetBlue. The airline is a depreciating asset, losing value year after year. JetBlue's slots are an appreciating one, gaining value in the exact same years. A patient competitor understands the difference perfectly. So look at what United is really doing here, because it is far smarter and far colder than a simple takeover. A merger would force United to swallow the whole thing. The debt, the labor contracts, the unprofitable routes, the $9 billion anchor chained to the bottom of it all. Why on earth would anyone do that when they can simply wait? If JetBlue eventually stumbles into a restructuring, a partner who is already sitting at the table is in the perfect position to walk through the wreckage afterward and pick out only the valuable pieces. The Kennedy slots, the Boston position, the Fort Lauderdale gates, the good airframes, and leave the debt and the deadweight behind for someone else to bury. You do not buy the whole cow when you can wait for the farm to fail, and then buy only the good acres. That is the strategy, hiding inside the innocent little word partnership. It is not a rescue. It is a slow, patient dismantling, wearing the costume of a friendship. But there is one more player in this story, and this player might just complicate everything: the referee. When Spirit Airlines collapsed, its slots at these New York airports did not simply vanish. They went back into the system to be reassigned. And the federal aviation authorities have started saying something that should terrify United. Their stated preference is that valuable New York slots should go to low-fare airlines, the kind that keep ticket prices down for ordinary travelers. And if no low-fare carrier steps up to take them, they would rather see those slots retired entirely, quietly erased to ease congestion, than watch them get swallowed by a dominant legacy giant. Do you see the problem that creates? United is not a low-fare airline. United is precisely the kind of enormous, dominant carrier the regulators are trying to keep those slots away from. So even the clean, patient plan, wait for the collapse and asset shop the wreckage, runs straight into a government that may simply refuse to let the most valuable pieces of JetBlue land where United wants them. Which means the fight over JetBlue's corpse could begin long before JetBlue is actually dead. And here is what makes this whole thing tragic rather than just brutal. The original bet was not wrong. Betting everything on Kennedy was one of the smartest strategic calls in modern aviation, and it worked spectacularly for 2 full decades. What changed was not the strategy. What changed was the entire world around the strategy. 20 years ago, a scrappy airline with a clever idea and an overlooked airport had genuine room to grow because the giants were slow and distracted and fat. Today, the industry has hardened into a small handful of enormous carriers with oceans of cash, and a mid-sized airline dragging $9 billion of debt simply cannot outweight them anymore. When fuel prices spike, the giants shrug and ride it out. When JetBlue's fuel bill doubles, it starts closing crew bases in the middle of the night. Same storm, completely different boats. There is a strange and uncomfortable lesson buried in all of this about what actually lasts in a business. JetBlue spent 20 years building a brand, a culture, a loyal following, an entire identity wrapped around being the airline that beat the giants at Kennedy. And in the end, none of that turned out to be the durable thing. The brand did not save it. The loyalty did not save it. The clever low-fare model that once terrified the whole industry did not save it. The only piece with any lasting value turned out to be the least glamorous thing the company ever owned: the plain, finite, physical right to land a plane at a crowded airport. Everything human about JetBlue can fade, only the concrete holds. So where does that leave JetBlue heading into the next 2 years? Fighting to service $9 billion of debt. In a market it is actively fleeing. Against rivals it can no longer outspend. While the one asset that keeps it interesting to anyone at all is slowly siphoned across the table to a larger competitor, not through a dramatic takeover, but slot by slot, gate by gate, handshake by handshake. 20 years ago, JetBlue looked at an airport the giants had abandoned and saw an opportunity nobody else could see. Today, a giant is looking at JetBlue's wreckage and seeing exactly the same thing. The bet on Kennedy may go down in history not as the foundation of a great independent airline, but as the one truly valuable thing JetBlue ever built. Valuable enough to outlive the airline that built it. Because airlines like this one do not always die in a crash. Sometimes they are simply taken apart, quietly, patiently, by the very people who once refused to fight them at all. And what happens inside a courtroom when an airline this size finally runs out of runway? Who walks away with the slots? Who gets stuck with the debt? And why that fight has secretly already begun? That is a story all its own. If this changed the way you think about JetBlue, or about the hidden fortune locked inside something as boring as a landing slot, subscribe and tell me in the comments. Do you think JetBlue survives this as a real airline, or does it end up as spare parts? And send this to the one person you know who has flown out of Kennedy 100 times and never once knew the story sitting underneath it.